Thank you to everyone for, there it is. Just wanted to say thank you to everyone for joining us today in our November call of the Community of Practice of CARL Repository Librarians and Community. So today's session is going to be broken down into two different parts. Our first part will be a series of presentations from some panelists having to do with our topic about what else belongs in institutional repositories. That portion will be recorded, after which we will stop the recording and then go into a discussion that perhaps will be a little bit more freeform for a total of about an hour and a half of your time today. So without further ado, let's dip into a little bit of a survey just to set the stage about our different attitudes towards material in our digital repositories. So on the screen here is a Mentimeter carefully being driven by Robin. And if we can all log in a browser window, fire up the code there, and let's see what kind of results we can get from these couple of questions that we have prepared. Excellent. Thank you, everyone, for participating. We can see the results coming in. Without a doubt, ETD, our primary and first love and first sort of raison d'etre for these things is well represented. But I like to see the expanse of different material types being represented here. That's very interesting and good food for thought for today.
Awesome. Are we ready to go to the next one?
Absolutely. I thought it was going to settle a little bit and then we could have a look at the final product, but no, we're all deeply engaged. So yeah, let's have a look at our second question.
All right, it's settled. No, that's awesome. We'll share a screenshot of these with everyone after the session. So the next one you might want to guess is, what stuff does not belong in your institutional repository? What are the things where you're like, no?
Oh. While the answers are displaying to the screen, I'll just note that the first question got us 100+ responses within seconds. The second question is a little bit longer to get the responses in, a little bit more, I think, care and attention with the response to this. It's very interesting. Wow, we could spend an hour and a half just diagnosing some of these descriptions. Confusing metadata intrigues me, but yeah, we'll wait for the discussion to dig into anything.
All right, I think it's settled.
Okay, very good.
Awesome.
Thank you, Robin, for driving that for us. And thank you, everyone, for participating in submitting your answers or your thoughts on the questions. It's a good way to sort of get us engaged in the topic before we start our panel discussion, which I have the pleasure of doing so now. So just a brief word on changes to the panel composition. Originally, Priscilla Cremini from York University was scheduled to join us. She unfortunately will not be able to be on the panel today. Having said that, though, I'll happily introduce everyone else. Joining us is Roger Gillis, digital archivist from Dalhousie University. Also joining us is Robin Hall, Scholarly Communication Library from MacEwan Library. MacEwan University, pardon me. Christy Hurrell, Library and Director from LabNext at University of Calgary. Leah McCauley, Community Engagement Librarian at the University of British Columbia. And Caroline Sullivan, Systems Librarian from University of Ottawa. So we'll hand over the microphone to Roger. Please go for it.
Oh, hi. Can you hear me okay?
Absolutely. Yep.
Sure. I'm just going to bring up my camera here. All right. And I trust you can see me as well. Good.
For sure.
Yeah. So thanks, everybody. I'm Roger Gillis. I'm the digital archivist at Dalhousie University. And today I'm going to talk a little bit about the kind of benefits and challenges of archival material within institutional repositories. I've been around IRs for going on like 15 years now. And as I was reflecting on this question, I was thinking back to a time where IRs were very much a new thing and we were launching them. And we were there was a lot of like excitement building around what their potential was. And I think one of the things that was an issue from the start is that the institutional repositories became a bit of a catch-all. And they were housing a lot of material. We were sort of just like stuffing everything that we could get in there. And then as time went on, it became apparent that, hey, maybe this isn't necessarily the right place for all of this stuff. And with archival material in particular, one of the things that grew in tandem with the growth of IR systems was archival finding aid catalogs and digital preservation systems and digital collection systems. And the number of options really just grew over time, and then it became necessary to look at these systems in terms of their strengths and weaknesses. So when I think of IRs as it relates to archival material, I often compare them to archival finding aid catalogs, mostly because that's what I'm most familiar with and dealing with these days. So I look at them in terms of the potential I have in comparison to these other systems. And I think too, I think that there's a lot of similarities between them, but there's also they are each kind of a breed of their own. Yeah, just to give you a sense of where I'm coming from when I look at that IRs. So in terms of benefits, I think IRs provide a lot of different benefits for archival materials. So a lot of the plugins that we see within IRs are really great, and I actually see these lacking a lot in archival finding aid catalogs. So things like IIIF viewers, the capabilities of interacting with digital archival materials there's a lot of enhancements that are in IRs presently that other systems are lacking. Things like persistent identifiers. So something that I think archival finding aid catalogs often lack as well. So things like handles and web resolvable PIDs are really something that IRs have that a lot of other systems don't. And I think IRs do a really good job of allowing for and exposing materials for indexing and further discoverability. So there's a lot of capabilities in this sense as well. And IRs, I find the metadata, this was kind of pointed out, the confusing metadata can be a big big thing. And I think one of the things that IRs offer too is greater capabilities around handling more machine readable metadata, like Creative Commons licenses, rights statements, things like that. So yeah, I think what are some of the challenges that I see with IRs as it relates to archival materials is with again, speaking of confusing metadata, archival metadata is one of those confusing metadata standards. So it's often hierarchical in nature, and in the Canadian context, we use roles for archival description, and that often doesn't translate into things like Dublin Core, more basic and user-friendly metadata standards that tend to be used by IRs. So I think archival material within IRs can sometimes lead to loss of context when you have archival materials in IR, and you can't really represent the archival material as accurately as you might do with archival finding aids. And I think too, one of the issues too is that there's often a bit of a loss of context. So with archival collections, sometimes like just the portion of that collection is digitized, and you can't necessarily represent a non-digitized collection as you would with an archival finding aid alongside a digitized collection as well in IRs as you might be able to in other systems. And I think too, like one of the things that we're increasingly looking at is the integration of digital preservation systems and behind the scenes workflows with IRs, and also with material that's going to end up in archival finding aids catalog. So sometimes the whole digitization workflows don't always sync up. And I know some organizations have had more success with this than others around like putting digital preservation workflows into IRs. Yeah, so I guess where I land on this, I think that there's both benefits and challenges, and as it comes to archival material in institutional repositories. And I think that I would tend to side on not putting archival material in IRs. I think institutions have to really decide where they want to focus their efforts. And for us, it's been focusing largely on the archival finding aid through access to memory. But for others, you might really value your IR. So it's really an individual institutional choice, and there are certainly benefits to be had there too. So I think that's pretty much all I had to say on that.
Very good. Thank you, Roger. We will move on to our next panelist now. Robin, please go ahead.
Thanks, Tim. So I'm just sharing some links to things that I'm going to speak to. I didn't make any slides or anything. So Priscilla Cremini from York was going to talk about open educational resources. And since she cannot be here today, I thought I'll come up with something, because that's an area we've dipped our toes in a little bit. So I'm going to talk about open ed. I do have to leave at the top of the hour, so I won't be here for the full discussion, but I do think this is an important area to think about. So please do discuss when I'm not here. So my perspective is, do open educational resources belong in repositories? I think it really depends. So when I'm talking about open educational resources, I mean teaching resources that are under open licenses that can be remixed, reused, shared, adapted for teaching purposes. We're all on the same page. So I think some of these resources are more living documents that are ephemeral and have their place in time, and maybe long-term digital preservation doesn't matter so much. So thinking about assignments and PowerPoint slides from classes and syllabi, I think the discovery of this stuff is a bit more important, and making sure that instructors know where to find it. So I think it's really important for those of us working in repositories to know about open education repositories where we can refer people to share this stuff, where other instructors will find it, where the metadata serves those resources a little bit better, where the search facets serve those resources a little bit better. People can find things by discipline. They can find different types of resources at different educational levels for teaching purposes. So the two that we generally recommend are oercommons.org and merlot.org as well. They've been around for a long time. They're a really good place for a lot of open educational resources, just to make those discoverable. At the same time, I think open textbooks are something that I consider scholarly activity. I think if somebody takes the time and effort to create an openly available textbook, they're putting a lot of time and effort into it. They're putting their research into it typically. So in our repository, rome.mcewen.ca, we do say in our kind of terms of use that learning objects can be included only insofar as they reflect creative and scholarly activities and outputs. So we do deposit PDF versions of the open textbooks that our faculty create on our Pressbooks service. So it's web-based open textbooks, but we can generate a PDF version and make those available in the repository. That way they get some academic credit. It's a form of knowledge mobilization. We do it all for them with their consent, of course. So the advantages of this are just that added discoverability through Google Scholar, also digital preservation of the PDF versions of these at least. There are definitely some big challenges with this though, and it's an imperfect preservation solution. First of all, instructors are not looking for open textbooks in an institutional repository. So that's something for us to consider, and we make sure that these things are still available in lots of other places where they will be found. I have in my notes messy metrics because in the repository you'll get the usage metrics for the PDF version we're putting in, but then you'd also have to go to the Pressbooks version and pull the usage metrics there if you want to make a case for the reach and impact of your work and who's viewing and downloading it. File formats have proven to be an issue. I mean, PDFs do not really support open educational resources that are meant to be reused by people. It's very much a static document, so it sort of defeats the purpose in the open education world. Someone would need to know to go and find the Pressbooks version, and then they can make copies of that instead. We've also had a lot of issues with people putting their content into Pressbooks through from Word documents, and then it creates a lot of source code that makes the PDFs look terrible because they just don't convert properly. Or people with LaTeX mathematical equations, those often don't convert properly. Also, if they're creating videos and other types of multimedia, that stuff is not going to get preserved in the PDF version that we put into the repository unless we figured all of that out manually. And the last challenge I have here is just version control, because we encourage our faculty to update their open textbooks, make changes to it, and create a version history record at the end of their open textbooks where they make those changes. If we want to make sure that we're preserving this content in our PDFs, we'd have to know when they're making those changes and then put new versions into the repository, either attached to the existing record, or if it's a totally new edition, maybe a separate record and then link between them. We have not gotten that far, but it feels really messy to me trying to figure this out. And then we haven't really looked at web archiving of Pressbooks itself, which I think is something we need to take a closer look at as well. Because as I said, I think this stuff is academic works. It deserves academic recognition. I think that it does have a long-term usage for it. So it's really important that we think about this stuff. But for now, we're putting our PDFs in. And when we get to the discussion portion, I'm really curious to hear what other people are doing with their open ed resources and their repositories, if it's something you've looked at, if it's something you've tried, and if you've grappled with some of these issues. And that's it. Thanks.
Great. Thanks, Robin. We'll now proceed to our next presenter. Christy, please go ahead.
Thank you, Tim. I did make 2 slides. So I'm just going to share my screen real quick here. Hopefully everyone can see that. So I have been asked to speak about gray literature and the Declaration on Research Assessment, which some folks may be familiar with and may not. Just want to make sure everyone can see my screen now.
Yes, indeed.
Good stuff. Okay, so gray literature, I think probably folks in this call are familiar with the definition of what gray literature is, but we usually think about gray literature as things like reports, policy documents, working papers, newsletters, speeches, those types of things. But I think most of my comments today are really generalizable to all sorts of what I like to call non-traditional research outputs. So that's a term that is probably best defined by what it's not. So anything that's not a typical kind of peer-reviewed journal article, book chapter, or monograph. And I think, so some of the things I'm saying today are probably generalizable to what other folks are talking about more specifically. So in case you're not familiar with the Declaration on Research Assessment, I have excerpted one phrase from it in both English and French translations. So the Declaration on Research Assessment has been around for a while now. It's researcher-led, and it comes out of dissatisfaction with the way in which research is currently being assessed for rewards such as grants, hiring, promotion, and tenure. So I think in this crowd, a lot of people are very familiar with the limitations of traditional research assessment, right? The things that sort of count in research assessment are pretty narrow. So things like, peer-reviewed journal articles, books, monographs, and the impacts are also narrow. So the traditional kind of quantitative bibliometric impacts such as journal impact factor and H-index that we all know are very limiting and biased. And I think those realizations are being recognized by an increasing number of folks within the research ecosystem, that these metrics are limiting, they're inequitable, and they don't align with the stated mission and goals of many people within the research ecosystem, whether those are universities, funding agencies, et cetera. So these factors are influencing some of these organizations to sign on to statements such as DORA. And when my own institution, the University of Calgary, signed on to DORA in 2019, I was really interested in this particular statement from the recommendation that talks about considering the value and impact of all research outputs in addition to publications, and considering a broad range of impact measures, including qualitative indicators of research impact, such as influence on policy and practice. And when I saw those words, I thought, oh, I think there's an opportunity for our repositories here. And what I think the opportunities are is, repositories, we're not constrained by the profit motives of traditional publishers. And so we can handle a wide variety of content types and formats. They don't have to fit into a specific box of, what a journal article looks like, no specific word count. So I think our repositories can be quite capacious in terms of what types of formats they accept. And we all know sort of what the alternative is for the research community. They build a project website, it's funded by a grant. After the 3 to 5 years of project funding ends, or the research coordinator gets a new job, that website dies, and all the PDFs that they carefully archived on that website die with it. Besides, that stability and longevity, repositories offer a lot of benefits that some of the other panelists have already talked about. So things like, persistent identifiers, better discoverability. Many repositories do integrate impact metrics of various types. So things like downloads, views, perhaps alt metrics. And these types of features can really help kind of demonstrate the reach and impact of non-traditional research outputs like gray literature. Also, of course, repositories are supported by wonderful staff who can provide expertise around things like publishing best practices, digital preservation, copyright, and evaluating the impact of outputs. And this is expertise that a lot of researchers just don't have. One other thing I think for me, as someone who's been working in the kind of scholarly communication space for a number of years now, is it's kind of an opportunity to make the repository more fun again. I think since the tri-agency policy on open access came into place, some folks, the kind of prevailing feeling about the repositories is something that you have to do to archive, your peer-reviewed publications in there to sort of meet the requirements of your grant. And I think by encouraging researchers to put these different materials in there that may not find a home elsewhere, it's a way to sort of inject a little bit more joy back into the repository experience, which I think, you know, doesn't want we don't want to overlook that piece of it. In terms of challenges, I think challenges are the same for us, regardless of the types of material: awareness, outreach, marketing, letting people know that the repository exists. Sometimes staff are overburdened with all sorts of other tasks. And I think sometimes peer-reviewed materials are so valued by our research communities that trying to sort of encourage folks to think about non-traditional outputs that may not be peer-reviewed as worthy of putting in the repository can be a challenge as well. So I think that's all I'll say for now. I'll stop showing my screen and pass it on to the next person.
Great. Thank you, Christy. We'll move on to our next presenter. Aaliyah, please go ahead.
Thank you. Is the sound okay? Awesome. Thank you.
Yes,
Thanks. I am so excited to be here. My perspective on the topic today is around the potential for using IRs for community-based research outputs. And I have to say, I share the enthusiasm of Christy in terms of the potential here. And my experience is kind of really grounded a little differently in the sense that it's coming from working on campus community engagement projects that tend to be smaller in nature and a bit more place-based, but have prompted opportunities for me to work more closely with our brilliant IR team here at UBC. So I wanted to say I'm joining today from the traditional, ancestral, and ceded territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh Nations as a settler and uninvited guest. I'm really seeking to better understand what it means to do community-centered work on stolen lands. And I want to also say that I'm very aware that our institutions operate in colonial ways, and I have personally and professionally benefited from this kind of throughout my life and academic career. And in terms of the conversation today, it's prompting me to kind of reflect on how this plays out in our collections related work. As we know, we have the tendency to preference certain kinds of knowledge over others, and actively excluding kind of in that process. So I'm encouraged by the generosity of the communities and the collaborators that are kind of helped me to grow and improve my professional practices kind of along the way. So I'm new to the group, so really want to thank you all for being here and for the opportunity to kind of learn with you. I'm sort of working through these ideas, so bear with me. I'm really excited for the conversation and sort of what I'm learning already. In terms of context, I just wanted to kind of say that my work is very, as a community engagement librarian, very collaborative and includes really working alongside knowledge brokers and other academic units that have expertise in community engagement and kind of knowledge and relationships with communities outside of the campus community. So I'm really interested in ways that we can do academic library work that is more community centered and benefits the public. And in that is sort of experimenting with ways we can make good use of library managed infrastructure. So the community that I've been working the most with that sort of led to my collaborations with the IR team is in Vancouver. It's predominantly a lower income population and has received a lot of research attention due to high concentrations and themes of poverty, substance use, precarious housing, compromised health, and other expressions of historical trauma. And so kind of where we've landed in our project was building kind of a bit of a hybrid approach where we use the institutional repository as the home of materials that kind of we found have been a good fit, which have been kind of pre and post prints and knowledge translations of articles and some community generated works, which are similar to the materials that Christy was maybe just talking about. But we've also built a discovery kind of layer on top of that, which allows us to create an interface that allows us to do things a little differently and experiment with custom metadata elements and include more materials that are housed outside of the institutional repository in an effort to respond to community needs. So that allows us to do a little bit more kind of curation as we go and to be able to create records for items that are open access elsewhere, even restricted. And this is kind of important because we've learned that not for good reasons, every organization has chosen to kind of work with us with some of their materials. So I'm going to try my best to extrapolate what I've learned from this very specific context to shed some light on maybe how we could make good use of IRs for our community engagement work as academic librarians. And my hope is that this might lead to some considerations we can explore together. So I certainly have more questions than answers. So hopefully I'm in the right place for that kind of approach. So yes, I was asked to speak around community-based research outputs. So what do I mean? So I just wanted to touch on some examples of the materials that we've kind of considered as community-based research outputs. So we do work with articles and we don't limit to the research method, although we are actively collecting community-based or community-led participatory research and public scholarship as a kind of a priority. And my reflections on this is that they fit, obviously very well in our IR, and our IR team has been instrumental in guiding us in sort of how to approach outreach and engagement with researchers and students around those kinds of work. And the IR policies and metadata and acquisition policies and those kinds of things fit really well, obviously, with those kinds of materials. But there are some areas where we are experimenting with metadata that is a little different. So just as one example, customizing affiliations in a way that is less campus focused and kind of reflects roles like peer researchers and others that are participating in more community-led participatory types of research. So some of the questions that we've kind of been grappling with in our work is, how do IRs typically describe non-affiliated roles in terms of research? And, from a community end user perspective, these materials are really organized by faculty and discipline, and how does that reflect the experience of users off campus trying to find those materials? And then also, how do we correlate materials of interest to a specific geographic community? And before our project started, our IR team wasn't making regular use of geotagging, but that was a brilliant way that we've been able to kind of correlate materials that are published by community faculty and students. Another area of materials that we collect is around public scholarship, or what I call as like accessible translations of research. So these can be published by students, staff, or community-facing research groups, and they're kind of those non-traditional genres that others have spoken to. So these can include things like clear language summaries, video abstracts, infographics, community research project reports, even presentations, things like that. So there, again, in terms of reflections, are materials that are typically, again, seem to be reasonably suited for our IR, but there could be some challenges in terms of how we describe or present these materials in relation to each other, because the article is often kind of considered the main or centered work in terms of how things might be organized. So we found it helpful to kind of have discussions around, what is a derivative or supplementary material, and how do these knowledge translations relate in terms of academic research in the same area. And also, the IR interface we found to be have some limitations in terms of how end users might make sense of these relationships. So that sort of prompted us also to kind of have our different interface. And then lastly, the other kind of material, which is maybe a little different, is sort of a bit of this gray literature, or community, what we call community generated materials. So this is where we work more with organizations in the community. And these could include things like annual reports, community program reports, newsletters, policy advocacy materials, creative works like dance studio or festival programs, podcasts, and more. And we're really excited about these materials in that they have the ability to kind of share with the academic and public audiences materials that really sort of capture the creativity and pride, resistance, activism, community service, and sort of, all of the energy that's sort of taking place in the community as well. So again, we've obviously found that these materials have been great candidates in our IR, but we've had to maybe interrogate some of the policies or adapt them in ways. And we've also, I guess, found that the outreach takes a bit more care, and so does the descriptive work when we're working with these materials. So, we tend to do this work again in collaboration with our partners and sort of leveraging the network to make connections. And really, we're starting from a place of conversations to learn if preservation is really a kind of a priority with some of these authors or community organizations. And also trying to kind of gauge if the IR is seen as a useful and trusted repository and a kind of a good home for their materials. We're curious, to have conversations around around open access publishing, or if they would prefer for us to just describe materials and link out to their website. Just to give a sense, like sometimes it can take months to have these kind of correspondences to lead up to depositing to one item. And we've, been adapting our outreach scripts and workflows to be able to sort of carry out this work in sustainable ways. And of course, not, as I mentioned, all organizations have been kind of responsive to this. Also with the descriptive work, because we're kind of doing it at a project level, it's been, we've diverged in a lot of ways, or, we've had to be carrying out original cataloging. So it's definitely something that takes quite a bit more time and expertise. We're doing things like inviting community authors to review drafts of our record descriptions and sharing feedback with us, and sort of exploring the degree to which there's interest in sort of working with us to do that work. So in terms of taking a step back, I think there's lots of strengths and potential for IRs and benefits. It leads to a lot of opportunities to work kind of outside the library and to really showcase the community engaged work that's happening in the university, and connecting that back between the university and public audiences. It's, as one collaboration, we were able to work with the research office, which in turn kind of helps amplify these materials, which, can be often overlooked in merit, tenure, promotion kind of committees. So it's a way to really showcase that kind of work. It could also be an increasing opportunity as the Canadian Carnegie community engagement classification system launches in Canada in the coming years, and some of our institutions elect to go for that classification. And if that's new to anybody, I'm happy to share a little bit more information about it. But it seems like there could be, really potentials to explore how the library could sort of support the outputs of the university when it comes to these classifications. The IRs also could be a space to practice more knowledge equity and create opportunities for community-generated materials to be published, discoverable, and preserved alongside our academic, more traditional research. And we have the opportunity to carry out this work in partnership with knowledge brokers and others with community engagement expertise, which could result in more trust and credibility within our communities. So working in collaboration, both within groups across the library, but also outside, can lead to more bibliodiversity and overall inclusive collections. Of course, there's room for improvement. And I've probably gone way over time already, but I've tried to kind of put in some of the questions that we've been kind of considering as we go, and happy to sort of touch on those a little later as we get into the conversations. But I think that's pretty much what I was hoping to share, and want to thank you again, and looking forward to chatting more. Thanks.
Great. Thank you very much, Aaliyah. We'll hand it over now to Caroline. Please go ahead.
Bonjour à tous et à tous. You'll see that there's a French version of my slides in the chat. Just one moment while I try to share this. Okay. Can everyone see my screen okay?
Yes, indeed.
Excellent. Okay, so today I'm going to be speaking to the topic of data and software in institutional repositories. Et je m'appelle Caroline Sullivan et je suis bibliothécaire DCC pour les dépôts numériques at the University of Ottawa. And I'd like to thank the data librarians Felicity Taylor and Christy Thompson for their recommendations on this presentation. So first of all, I was very relieved and excited to see that everyone put, well, many people put data on the Mensi chart for things that probably don't belong in your institutional repository alongside your electronic theses and dissertations. It isn't our first choice. Researchers generally would prefer to share with their data community or disciplinary repository, delivering content where it will be used by other researchers. And one quote that I found that was very helpful is this quote from Cooper and Springer in an Ithaca white paper. While institutional repositories serve other useful purposes, we believe that they are a vehicle ill-suited to the support of data communities that cross institutional boundaries, because by their very nature, they segregate information according to the college or university at which they're created. Moreover, as we will see, data repositories are not always very well constructed to make specifically data sets findable. Another quote that comes from an article published in 2008, so it's maybe a little data, from Dorothy Sato in her article Innkeeper at the Roach Motel. She says that an institutional repository is like a Roach Motel in that data goes in, but it doesn't come out. And I would hope that our discoverability has improved somewhat in the last 15 years or so, but it's still perhaps not the best to put your data in there. But as we'll see, some of us are keeping data in these repositories, and there are some cases where it might be appropriate to keep it there and where it might be the best arrangement that works for our users. So I arrived at this panel, and in constructing this information for this panel, much like Ilya, with more questions than answers. So here's some of the exploration that I did. So it's difficult to know exactly how many institutions keep data alongside electronic theses and dissertations. It's not something reported, and it can happen on an ad hoc basis, but there was some data available on the subject in registries like the Lyrasis DSpace registry or in r3data.org, which is the global registry of data repositories. So there seems to be a trend based on the data in these repositories that, at least in Canada, we tend to keep our data in a Dataverse institutional repository apart from our electronic theses and dissertations, whereas internationally, where we don't have this lovely Borealis Dataverse national infrastructure, you'll see a lot more repositories with combined content, often using DSpace. So, for example, here's a screenshot from the Lyrasis registry of 10 Canadian institutions currently using DSpace to host data sets in their IRs. And some of them have like content organization, and some cases it's sort of mixed in there. But in the case of U Ottawa, we do have an institutional repository of Dataverse dedicated to hosting data sets. But I knew from our Carl statistics that we did have some data sets inside our DSpace repositories. So I decided to use pSQL commands to print the metadata relating to these data sets to a CSV file for review. And I decided to take a look at what we had. So you see we have like 109 data sets and 2 software. And at this point, you'll also notice I had to do this on the server. It is possible to do a faceted search and configure that in DSpace to search by content type, but we haven't yet done that. And I'm not sure if many of us have created like the configuration necessary to create faceted searches by content type in DSpace. But anyways, so looking at the metadata relating to these data sets, a couple of issues stood out to me. You'll notice that we have a ton of data sets for this getting beyond the fence, which are access to information requests that were added to DSpace as individual records, each with the same abstract, probably before data-specific institutional software had been popularized. As Roger Gillis noted, there's a lot of kind of artifactual things and atavistic things in our repositories sometimes that happened as our software evolved and as we started to gain different options for deposit. So at this point, there isn't any cross-linkage between these separate records to indicate they're part of the same series. And it would be much easier for the user to find and explore the set of data relating to this study if they were collected in a single folder. But DSpace doesn't allow for very good hierarchical organization of related files unless you're willing to multiply your use of collections and subcollections. Borealis Dataverse does allow for pretty good hierarchical organization. So in cases like this, if the depositor is amenable and isn't like, oh, I have to learn a new platform, I would recommend that they use Dataverse. We also had records. The data set had been deposited separately from an accompanying thesis or an article hosted on another web page. Similarly, some of these lacked cross-linkage to indicate that the article page for the data set existed or vice versa. So in those cases, I think that it would be helpful if a link was added in the related resource Dublin correlation field to help users recognize that this data exists. In reviewing what data sets were already in our repository, I also took a look at items with extensions typically reserved for data or software because sometimes data sets get submitted alongside theses or articles and kind of pass beneath our notice because they're collated with these resources. So there are a fair number of those. And you'll notice that, yes, we do have Excel files here, which did come up on the Menti word cloud for resources that we might not necessarily want in the institutional repository. However, if they're part of a thesis, well, it kind of makes sense according to the agreement for thesis deposit for them to be uploaded with that thesis. The question I kind of have, and I don't have an answer to this, is whether the depositors have made the data sets available elsewhere for where there might, where they might be more findable, and if there's a pain-free way to encourage them or help them to make them more findable for use. A quick note on software. There were very few resources marked as software in our IR or files having extensions like .mat, which would be MATLAB files, or .html that would suggest they were code. And on examination, most of the website-specific extensions pertain to theses or articles that were originally made available on personal web pages. And the MATLAB files were typically attached to like theses. One reason why we might not see a lot of software in IRs and why we probably wouldn't be hosting it is because there's not a lot of demand, since programmers tend to make their open source code available through GitHub, since there are high incentives for them to do so. There's a strong open source culture in programming. GitHub, which is the coding repository, is used as version control, which is all but essential for developing complex code. And it has excellent searches by like programming language or keyword that can be used to help folks who are looking for solutions to code specific problems. So what are the best policies for depositing data and software? If the material is only data, or the data accompanies an article hosted elsewhere, I would send the researcher to the data librarian so they can suggest the repository best for the user's needs, whether that be a disciplinary repository, Dataverse, etc., because that's where they're going to be best found for eventual discoverability. And it's also just simpler to navigate for data and series of data, and allows for versioning. And yeah, if data accompanies a thesis in the IR, with our deposit agreements, it probably makes sense to host the data in the IR, but I'm not sure how you would encourage folks to ensure that it actually becomes findable later. Hopefully your researcher is open to posting the data in a disciplinary repository and maybe cross-linking to the version of the record in the institutional repository, but that's something to consider. And I'll save questions for the end, but here are some of the resources I used. And if you can, I recommend reading this article on data communities. And Felicity Taylor recommended it to me, and it really put in context for me exactly how the relationship works between institutional repositories, data, and disciplinary repositories, and how we can best support scientific research. So yes, that's about it. I'll turn you over to Tim Riberick then for the next part he has planned.
Great. Thank you, Caroline. Please please join me now in giving a round of virtual applause for our panelists. And we are now going to transition into the second portion of our session today. So with that said, I'll ask that the recording is stopped, and then we can begin in our conversation portion of today's